So today we're diving into 16th century Scotland, a time when accusations of witchcraft, they weren't just rumors, they were debated by scholars and echoing in courtrooms.
Yeah, you've given us some really interesting sources on this. Excerpts from King James VI's own Demonology, and then this pamphlet about the very dramatic rise and fall of a sorcerer named Dr. Fian.
Two very different takes on a very real fear.
Yeah.
Now, I have to admit, a king writing a book on demonology, that's not exactly your average royal hobby.
Definitely unique. But for King James, you have to remember, this wasn't just an academic thing. He really thought witches were dangerous, not just to people, but to his reign, to Scotland itself.
So he saw this as like a national security threat, not just some fascination with the occult.
Exactly. And this fear, it comes across in everything he did and wrote. Like there's this story about his interaction with Sir John Harrington, who was a writer and courtier. James just grilled him, basically, about why Satan, supposedly, would specifically target ancient women.
You mentioned that before, this focus on older women. Was that just like typical sexism of the time, or was there something else going on?
It's complicated, and it goes way back. Older women, they were often in a very vulnerable position, right? Widows, living alone, no support from men or financially,
Hmm.
easy to accuse, and they couldn't really fight back the same way.
So they were pushed to the margins of society, and that made them vulnerable.
Exactly. Plus, there was this idea that women were just weaker-willed, more likely to be tempted by the devil. Combine that with all the weirdness around aging, women who didn't fit the mold, and yeah, it's a recipe for disaster.
A recipe for disaster, suspicion, vulnerability, and everyone's just looking for someone to blame. That's chilling. And James, he really leaned into those existing beliefs with his demonology, even going so far as to categorize magic. It's like he was creating a hierarchy of evil.
Totally. He separates Maggie, sometimes called necromancy, which was all about like commanding the devil with your knowledge, your studies, and then sorcery, or what we'd call witchcraft, driven by more like basic desires,
Yeah.
revenge, getting ahead, things like that.
So your black magic scholars versus your vengeful neighbors, right?
Yeah, pretty much. But here's the thing. James thought the magicians, those who tried to command the devil, they were worse.
Really?
Yeah.
The scholars were worse than, like, the people putting curses on their neighbors. That doesn't make sense.
I know, it seems strange, but to James, trying to control a being like the devil, even with good intentions, that was a direct challenge to God, a sin of like intellectual arrogance, trying to steal God's power.
So it's all about staying in your lane, even if you're dealing with the devil. Don't overstep, particularly with something that powerful. Fascinating, this insight into James's mind. But before we get too far, let's shift to that other source, about Dr. Fian. This feels like we're about to leave academia and jump right into, well, a much juicier story.
Exactly. This pamphlet, News from Scotland, it gives us a look into a very public and very dramatic trial. Dr. Fian, this supposed sorcerer, right in the thick of the infamous North Berwick witch trials.
Okay, so from King's theories on demons, we're going to an actual witch trial. These North Berwick trials, what were they about, and how did this Dr. Fian get involved?
So the North Berwick trials, they were a huge deal in Scotland back then, late 1500s. It was all this political drama, religious anxieties, and, well, just plain fear-mongering all mixed up. And Dr. Fian, he was a schoolmaster, but they accused him of being this powerful sorcerer leading a whole coven of witches.
Sounds like something straight out of a dark fairy tale.
Yeah.
What landed this Dr. Fian in the middle of this witch hunt?
Well, it started with this woman, Gillis Duncan. People thought she could heal the sick, almost miraculously, and then, boom, accused of witchcraft. They tortured her, and she confessed she was practicing witchcraft, and then she named other people.
The classic domino effect. One confession, usually forced, and then it just like snowballs from there.
Exactly. And we got to remember how they got these confessions. Sleep deprivation, thumb screws. The Turkas, that one was brutal. Forced their mouths open with these iron spikes.
It reminds you how easily power can be abused, all in the name of truth. They'd use these confessions forced out of someone to go after even more people.
Absolutely. They wanted to prove what they already believed, no matter how horrific the methods. But it is interesting how these confessions, pulled out under such pain, they reflect what people feared back then.
You mean like that stuff in the pamphlet about witches sailing in sieves and meeting the devil? It's like almost dreamlike how fantastical it is.
Right. Take the sieves, for example. That detail, it wasn't just random. It played into this big fear that witches could mess with the natural order, control the elements.
And meeting the devil at the kirk. That must have hit a nerve, with everyone already on edge about religion changing.
Absolutely. These confessions, they weren't just about magic. They were proof of a conspiracy against God and king. This was a time of huge religious upheaval. Scotland switching from Catholic to Protestant. The devil's is this real threat, just waiting to exploit any weakness.
So the devil's like this scapegoat for anything that seems threatening, religion, politics. And these accusations, they become a way to grab power, silence anyone who disagrees.
It's a recurring theme, right? These North Berwick trials, with their stories of pacts with the devil, storms conjured to sink ships, it all fed into those fears perfectly. Dr. Fian, his supposed crimes, they fit right in, this whole idea of a demonic plot against the crown.
Like that pamphlet was written specifically to use the anxieties that King James himself talked about in Demonology.
Right, like James wrote a lot about the devil changing shape to trick people, and then in the Dr. Fian pamphlet, boom, the devil's a man in black, a toad, a cat.
Shape-shifting. Makes you wonder how much of these confessions were influenced by what people like King James believed. How much was real, and how much was just to make the torture stop.
It's something historians still debate. Those trials, they were a product of their time. Fear and superstition were incredibly powerful.
Speaking of power, what could Dr. Fian supposedly do? He sounds like some kind of magical mastermind in this pamphlet.
They said he could drive people mad with witchcraft. And there's that creepy story about him using these knotted cords for his spells.
Knotted cords, that rings a bell.
Should. Remember how James, in Demonologie, he talks about objects used in witchcraft? Those cords, they become this physical link between the accused and, the demonic. Made the accusations even stronger.
It's like they use the language of demonology to condemn him. So we have these forced confessions, accusations based on like superstition, maybe some political maneuvering. Does Dr. Fian get out of this mess? Probably not, right? History and witchcraft accusations, not usually a good combination.
Yeah, you're right. The pamphlet, it describes this whole dramatic escape from prison, maybe even like supernatural help, but they caught him again. And the execution, by all accounts, it was awful. Tortured, strangled, and then burned.
Brutal. The life ending like that because of fear and superstition makes you think about all the people who were caught up in these witch hunts. How easy it was to use these accusations for, well, not so noble reasons.
Absolutely. And it wasn't just about getting rid of a few people either. These trials, they had a purpose, right? With the crazy accusations, the public executions, it reinforced the existing power structures, reminded everyone what happens if you step out of line.
Effective, I guess, but terrifying. And it's wild how they use demonology, those categories that King James made, to actually condemn people like Dr. Fian.
Totally. Shows you how powerful those beliefs were. It wasn't just theory, it was happening in courtrooms, deciding people's fates.
Makes you wonder how much was real belief and how much was, I don't know, taking advantage of the situation. Was James scared of witches, or did he just see how useful that fear could be?
Still up for debate. But we can definitely say that the North Berwick trials and this pamphlet, they give us this really fascinating and disturbing look into a society that was dealing with so much change, so much uncertainty.
A society where saying someone was a witch, it was a weapon, a way to control things and a reflection of their deepest fears.
Exactly. And when we look back at these stories, we have to ask ourselves some uncomfortable questions about fear, about what we believe, about abusing power. Those questions, they're still relevant even after all these centuries.
No doubt. So our deep dive into 16th century Scotland leaves us with, kind of a haunting reminder, right? That superstition and fear, they can stick around for a long, long time.
And maybe a challenge, too, to look at what we believe, question our assumptions, to not always go for the easy answers because the world's complicated.
Something to think about for sure. Thanks for joining us on this trip back to 16th century Scotland.